adjusted his worn prison uniform, and made his way down the sterile corridor of Block 7. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the metal walls of the station detention center. His footsteps echoed in the emptiness as he carried the small wooden chest set under his arm. The detention center floated in the void between Earth and the outer colonies, a massive structure that housed the galaxy's most dangerous criminals. Had been working here as a recreational therapist for 3 years now, and in all that time, he had never encountered a prisoner quite like the one in Cell 7 Alpha. The heavy blast door hissed open as approached. Inside the reinforced cell sat an elderly man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold the weight of centuries. His name was simply listed as, in the prison records, and his crimes were classified at the highest levels. Even with his security clearance, couldn't access the full details of what had landed this man in solitary confinement. "Good morning," said, setting up the chessboard on the small metal table bolted to the floor. "Ready for our daily match." The old man looked up from the book he was reading, a genuine smile crossing his weathered features. "Ah, you're the only bright spot in my days here. Please sit." Had started these chess games 6 months ago as part of the prisoner rehabilitation program. Most inmates were hostile or dismissive, but had been different from the beginning. He was intelligent, cultured, and spoke with an accent that couldn't quite place. Sometimes he would slip into languages that didn't recognize, though he always apologized and switched back to standard galactic. "You've been studying," observed as made his opening move. "Your Sicilian defense has improved considerably." Chuckled, "I have a good teacher, though I still can't figure out where you learned to play like this. The way you think 15 moves ahead, it's like you're playing a completely different game." A shadow passed across face, but it was gone so quickly that almost missed it. "I've had a lot of time to practice," the older man said quietly. "Time and experience." The game progressed in comfortable silence for several minutes. Had learned not to push too hard for personal information. The prison psychologists had warned him that many long-term inmates constructed elaborate fantasy lives to cope with their isolation. Sometimes spoke as if he had traveled to distant worlds, commanded vast fleets, and made decisions that affected billions of lives. Assumed it was the man's way of dealing with whatever terrible crime had landed him here. "Tell me about Earth," said suddenly, capturing Snight with his bishop. "Do the cherry trees still bloom in Washington District?" Blinked in surprise. "You've been to Earth. I thought travel was restricted for non-citizens." "I visited many years ago," replied carefully. "It was beautiful. I often wonder if it has changed." "The cherry trees still bloom," confirmed. "I grew up there. My grandmother used to take me to see them every spring." He moved his rook, trying to set up a defensive position. "What took you to Earth?" Studied the board for a long moment before making his move. "Diplomatic business, nothing interesting." He changed the subject quickly. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. What did she teach you?" Found himself telling about his childhood, about his grandmother's stories of the old days when humanity was just beginning to reach for the stars. She had lived through the First Contact War, when the Empire had nearly crushed human civilization before humanity's stubborn refusal to surrender had finally earned them respect among the galactic community. "She always said that humans were special because we never knew when to quit," continued, advancing a pawn. "Even when the odds were impossible, even when everyone said we should surrender, we kept fighting." Something flickered in his eyes. "Your grandmother was very wise," he said softly. "Humanity's determination is remarkable. I've seen few species with such tenacity." "You sound like you've studied us," observed. "Haven't we all?" replied with a small smile. "Humanity went from primitive to galactic citizenship in less than 2 centuries. It's quite remarkable." Was about to respond when the cell door chimed. A guard appeared, checking his chronometer. "Time's up. The prisoner needs to return to lockdown protocols." Began packing up the chess pieces, disappointed as always when their hour ended. These games had become the highlight of his week. Was the most interesting person he had ever met, full of stories and insights that seemed to come from vast experience. "Same time tomorrow?" asked. "I look forward to it," replied. "Perhaps you'll finally manage to defeat me." Laughed. "Keep dreaming, old man. You're too good for me." As the blast door sealed shut, couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important about that he was missing. The way the man spoke about distant worlds, about galactic politics, about humanity's rise to prominence. It was too detailed, too personal to be just fantasy. Walking back through the corridors, past the administration office where he caught sight of a news broadcast on the wall screen. The reporter was discussing the latest political developments in the remnant states, the fractured territories that had once been part of the mighty empire. Former emperor remains missing, the reporter was saying. The War Crimes Tribunal continues to search for the deposed ruler who disappeared during the collapse. Citizens across former imperial space continue to demand justice for his role in the genocide of the species and the devastating Outer Rim campaigns that claimed billions of lives. Froze, staring at the screen. The name echoed in his mind. It couldn't be a coincidence. He thought about the old man in Cell 7 Alpha, about his knowledge of distant worlds, his understanding of galactic politics, his familiarity with languages from across the galaxy. The way he sometimes spoke as if he had commanded armies, made decisions that affected star systems. Shook his head, trying to dismiss the ridiculous thought. The in his cell was just a lonely old man who liked chess and had an active imagination. The former emperor was one of the most wanted criminals in galactic history, responsible for atrocities that had shocked even the hardened veterans of the Galactic Council. Still, as walked home to his small apartment on the residential deck, he couldn't stop thinking about the coincidence. The next morning, he found himself looking up everything he could find about the former empire and its last ruler. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Emperor had ruled the empire for 47 years, transforming it from a small regional power into a galaxy-spanning civilization. He had been brilliant, charismatic, and utterly ruthless. His campaigns of conquest had brought hundreds of worlds under imperial rule, but at a cost that numbered in the billions of lives. The genocide alone had wiped out an entire species. The Outer Rim campaigns had devastated dozens of star systems. When the empire finally collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty, Emperor had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a legacy of horror that still haunted the galaxy. Stared at the historical images, trying to compare them to the gentle old man who played chess with him every day. The emperor in the photos was younger, harder, with cold eyes that seemed to calculate the value of every life around him. But the bone structure was similar, and those piercing blue eyes. He spent hours reading testimony from survivors of imperial rule. Stories of entire populations enslaved, of worlds stripped bare of resources, of families torn apart by the empire's brutal efficiency. The scope of the horror was almost incomprehensible. Yet when returned to Cell 7 Alpha the next day, he found himself looking at with new eyes. The old man greeted him warmly, as always, and set up the chess board with the same careful precision. "You seem troubled today, my friend," observed as they began their game. "Is everything all right?" Hesitated, studying the man's face. "I was watching the news yesterday about the Empire." His hand paused over his chess piece for just a moment. "Ah, ancient history, why does it trouble you?" "The things they did," said quietly. "The people who suffered, I can't imagine how someone could order those kinds of atrocities." "War is a terrible thing," agreed, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to come from personal experience. "Good people are forced to make impossible choices. Sometimes the line between right and wrong becomes blurred." "But genocide isn't blurred," said firmly. "Wiping out entire species isn't a difficult choice, it's evil." Looked up at him and for a moment saw something profound in those blue eyes. Pain, regret, and something that might have been shame. "Yes," said finally, "you're absolutely right. Some acts are simply evil no matter what justification is offered." He moved his queen, Pudding's king, in check. "Your humanity shows in your certainty about that. It's one of your species' greatest strengths." Moved his king to safety, his mind racing. There was something in his tone, something that suggested far more than academic knowledge of history. The way he spoke about war, about impossible choices, about humanity's moral clarity. Said carefully, "What exactly are you in here for?" The question hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Stared at the chessboard for a long moment, his weathered fingers tracing the edge of his captured pawn. "That's a dangerous question to ask in a place like this," he said finally. Felt his heart pounding. "The records are classified. Even with my clearance, I can't access them, but I've been wondering for months now." And what have you concluded from your wondering? His voice was carefully neutral. I think you're someone important, someone who made decisions that affected a lot of people. Leaned forward. Your knowledge of galactic politics, the way you speak about distant worlds like you've been there personally, your understanding of military strategy. It's not the knowledge of an ordinary criminal. Made his next move without looking at the board, his eyes fixed on space. You're very perceptive. It's one of the things I've come to value about our conversations. Are you going to tell me? Would it change anything between us? Asked. Would it change these games, our discussions, the friendship we've built? Considered the question seriously. Over the past 6 months, he had come to genuinely care about the lonely old man in Cell 7 Alpha. Their conversations were the highlight of his week, and he looked forward to their intellectual discussions almost as much as their chess matches. I don't know, admitted. I suppose it would depend on what you told me. Smiled sadly. An honest answer, I appreciate that. He gestured to the chess board. Shall we finish our game first? This may be our last one for a while. They played in relative silence, but could feel the tension building. Play was different today, more aggressive, as if he was taking risks he normally wouldn't consider. When finally achieved, checkmate nodded approvingly. Well played, you're improving rapidly. You let me win, accused. Perhaps I was distracted by other concerns. Began putting the pieces away with meticulous care. Before I tell you what you want to know, I need you to understand something. The galaxy is not the simple place that humans often believe it to be. Your species sees things in terms of right and wrong, good and evil. It's admirable, but it can also be limiting. You're stalling. Yes, I am, completed the setup, then folded his hands in his lap. My full name is, I was the last emperor of the empire. The words hit like a physical blow. Even though he had suspected, hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. He was sitting across from one of the most notorious war criminals in galactic history, a man responsible for atrocities that had shocked the civilized galaxy. The genocide, whispered. Among other things, yes. Stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the metal floor. His mind reeled as he tried to process the revelation. The man he had been sharing friendly conversations with for months, the person he had come to think of as a mentor and friend, was responsible for the deaths of billions. How many? Asked, his voice barely audible. How many what? How many people died because of your orders? Was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with exhaustion. I stopped counting after the first billion. It became abstract, numbers on reports rather than individual lives. Felt sick. He thought about all their conversations, all the times he had enjoyed this monster's company, all the chess games they had shared. Why are you telling me this? Because you asked, because you deserve the truth. Looked up at him. And because in 6 months of conversation, you're the first person to treat me as a human being rather than a symbol of evil. But you're not human, said bitterly. Humans don't do what you did. Don't they? His voice was soft but challenging. Have you studied your own history? The genocides, the wars, the systematic destruction of entire peoples. Humanity's rise to galactic prominence wasn't accomplished through peaceful means. Wanted to argue, but the historical record was clear. Humanity had fought brutal wars during their expansion phase, had made alliances with authoritarian regimes, had committed their own share of atrocities in the name of survival and progress. That was different, he said, though the words felt hollow. Was it, or do you simply tell yourselves it was different because the alternatives would have been unbearable? Sank back into his chair, his worldview crumbling around him. You're trying to justify what you did. No, said firmly. What I did was evil. I've had 3 years in this cell to think about that, to face the weight of every decision I made. I'm not seeking justification, I'm seeking understanding. Understanding of what? Of how good people can do terrible things, of how necessity and fear can corrupt even the best intentions, of how someone who genuinely loves their people can become a monster in service to that love. Stood and walked to the small window that looked out into space. Beyond the reinforced glass, stars glittered in the infinite darkness. The Empire wasn't born from malice, it was born from desperation. My people were dying. I was failing, our resources depleted, our population facing extinction. When I took power, we had perhaps 50 years left before complete collapse. So you conquered other worlds. I saved my people. The first conquests were surgical, targeted. We took what we needed to survive and no more. But each victory made the next one easier, and each success convinced us that we deserved what we took. The logic of empire is seductive. Once you begin, it becomes almost impossible to stop. Found himself listening despite his revulsion. The controlled the Vega cluster, some of the richest worlds in that sector of the galaxy. Their technology was centuries ahead of ours, their defenses seemingly impregnable. His reflection in the window looked haggard. My advisors told me that a conventional war would cost millions of lives and might still fail. The biological weapon seemed cleaner, more efficient. You murdered an entire species because it was convenient. I murdered an entire species because I convinced myself it was necessary, turned back to face. Do you know what the last said to me before he died? I was there watching the final phase of the operation. He looked at me and said, "I hope your people remember what you sacrificed for them." He wasn't angry, he was sad, sad for me for what I had become. Stared at this man who had just confessed to one of history's greatest crimes with such matter-of-fact calm. How do you live with yourself? For 47 years, I didn't think about it. I told myself that the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. I surrounded myself with advisors who told me I was saving civilization, that my actions were necessary for the greater good. Returned to his seat. It wasn't until the empire fell and I found myself alone that I began to understand what I had really done. And now I understand that there are some things that can never be forgiven, no matter the justification. Some choices that damn you regardless of your intentions. Met's eyes. But I also understand something about humanity that I never grasped before. What's that? Your species' greatest strength isn't your technology or your determination or your adaptability. It's your capacity to maintain your moral clarity even in the face of impossible choices. When humanity was facing extinction during the First Contact War, when the Empire had you and outnumbered by impossible margins, you could have surrendered. You could have accepted slavery in exchange for survival. Knew the history. The early days of the war had been devastating for humanity. The Empire had seemed invincible, their technology centuries ahead of human capabilities. But you didn't, continued. Even when your leaders knew that resistance meant the possible extinction of your entire species, humanity chose to fight. Not because you thought you could win, but because you believed that some things were worth dying for. We survived. You did more than survive. You inspired other species to resist. The Confederacy, the Vegan Republic, even some of my own subject worlds began to question imperial authority. Your example showed them that the Empire was not invincible, that there was another way. Felt a strange discomfort at hearing humanity's finest moment praised by the architect of galactic suffering. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to understand what you represent, what your species represents. You're not perfect, you make mistakes, you have your own history of violence and cruelty. But when it matters most, when the fundamental questions of right and wrong are on the table, humanity chooses correctly. Even when it costs us everything. Especially then, leaned forward. I studied your species for decades, trying to understand how to defeat you. I read your history, your literature, your philosophy. Do you know what I found? Shook his head. Every great human civilization has eventually faced a choice between survival and principles. And time and again, when that choice becomes absolute, humanity chooses principles. You would rather die as free beings than live as slaves. You would rather face extinction than compromise your fundamental beliefs about right and wrong. That's not always true, protested. We've collaborated, we've compromised, we've made deals with tyrants when we had to. Yes, but those were tactical decisions, not moral ones. When the choice becomes binary, when it's truly a matter of your soul versus your survival, humanity chooses its soul, smiled sadly. That about your people, I still do. Sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything he had learned. The man across from him was both monster and philosopher, criminal and teacher. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. What happens now? He asked finally. Now you have to decide what to do with what I've told you, said. You could report me, though I suspect the authorities already know who I am. You could stop coming to these games. You could have me transferred to a higher security facility. What do you want me to do? I want you to keep playing chess with me, said simply. These conversations with you have been the most meaningful part of my life in decades. For 6 months, I've been able to remember what it feels like to be seen as a person rather than a symbol. Stared at him, torn between revulsion and something that might have been pity. You're asking me to be friends with a war criminal. I'm asking you to show me the same humanity you've shown for the past 6 months. Not because I deserve it, but because it's who you are. The request hung between them like a challenge. Realized that this was exactly the kind of choice had been talking about. The easy thing would be to walk away, to report what he had learned, and never see this man again. The safe thing would be to maintain his moral clarity by rejecting any relationship with someone who had committed such atrocities. But was right about one thing. Humanity's strength lay not in their ability to make easy choices, but in their willingness to grapple with impossible ones. I need time to think, said finally. Of course, I'll be here. As walked back through the corridors of the detention center, he felt the weight of the revelation settling over him like a physical burden. He had befriended one of history's greatest monsters, and now he had to decide what that friendship meant. Didn't sleep that night. He paced his small apartment, staring out at the stars and trying to understand how everything had changed so completely in the span of a single conversation. Every memory of his interactions with was now colored by the knowledge of who the man really was. The gentle correction of his chess strategy came from someone who had orchestrated the deaths of billions. The thoughtful discussions about literature and philosophy came from the architect of genocide. The lonely old man who seemed grateful for companionship was one of the most wanted war criminals in galactic history. Found himself accessing the detention center's database, using his clearance to pull up everything he could find about the prisoner in Cell 7 Alpha. The official designation was simply Political Prisoner 7731, but now that he knew what to look for, the security measures made sense. The reinforced containment, the restricted access, the classified nature of the crimes, it all pointed to someone of enormous significance. What troubled most wasn't the revelation itself, but his own reaction to it. He had expected to feel pure revulsion, unambiguous horror at learning he had been befriending a monster. Instead, he found himself struggling with conflicting emotions. The man he had come to know over the past 6 months was still real, still the person who had challenged his thinking and engaged him in fascinating conversations. 3 days passed before return to Cell 7 Alpha. When the blast door opened, he found sitting at the small table, the chess board already set up. The old man looked up with an expression that mixed hope and resignation. I wasn't sure you would come back, said quietly. Took his seat across from the former emperor. Neither was I. They began to play without conversation, each move deliberate and thoughtful. Found himself studying face, looking for signs of the monster beneath the gentle exterior. But all he saw was an elderly man who seemed genuinely pleased to have company. Why did you surrender? Asked suddenly. Looked up from the board. I beg your pardon. When the empire fell, you could have fought to the end, gone down in a blaze of glory. Instead, you just disappeared. Why? Considered the question while moving his knight. Because I finally understood what I had become. The rebellion wasn't just political opposition. It was a moral awakening across the galaxy. Species that had been silent for decades were speaking out about imperial atrocities. My own people were beginning to question whether the price of their survival had been too high. So you ran. I recognized that I had lost the moral authority to rule. The empire had become everything I had once claimed to oppose, a machine that consumed lives for the benefit of the few. Captured one of Spawn's. Sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do is admit that they were wrong. Studied the board looking for his next move. But you never faced trial. The victims never got justice. Justice? Repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. What would justice look like for someone like me? Execution? Life imprisonment? Public humiliation? Would any of that bring back the or undo the suffering I caused? It might have provided closure for the survivors. Yes, it might have. That was selfish of me. Leaned back in his chair. I told myself I was sparing the galaxy a painful trial, but the truth is I was afraid. Afraid of facing the full weight of what I had done, afraid of seeing the victims testify about their losses. Made his move, putting King in check, and now I think about them every day. The families who died in their homes, the miners who were worked to death in imperial facilities, the soldiers who died believing they were fighting for something noble. Moved his king to safety. I remember their names, all of them. It's a small penance, but it's all I have. You remember all of them. Every casualty report, every intelligence briefing, every diplomatic summary that crossed my desk. I have perfect recall, a genetic enhancement that was supposed to make me a better leader. Instead, it ensured that I could never forget the cost of my decisions. Felt a chill as he considered the implications. To carry the memory of every atrocity, every death, every act of cruelty committed in his name, it would be a form of torture that no external punishment could match. Is that why you're here? Asked. Self-imposed exile. Partly, but also because I wanted to understand something about humanity that had always puzzled me. Gestured around the Stark cell. During the war, your species fascinated me. You were clearly outmatched, facing extinction, but you never lost your moral clarity. Even in defeat, even facing slavery or death, humans maintained their principles. And you wanted to understand that? I wanted to understand what it meant to be truly human, not biologically, but philosophically. What made your species different from the others I had conquered? Made his next move. So when I learned that this facility employed human rehabilitation therapists, I arranged to be transferred here. Stared at him. You arranged this. Our meetings aren't coincidental. The meetings were coincidental. I requested assignment to the Human Rehabilitation Program, but I had no control over which therapist would be assigned to me. Smiled slightly. I was fortunate that it was you. Why? Because you've shown me something I never expected to find. You've shown me that humanity's greatest strength isn't your refusal to compromise your principles. It's your ability to extend compassion even to those who don't deserve it. Felt uncomfortable with the praise. I haven't shown you compassion. I've barely been civil since you told me who you were. You're here, pointed out. After learning that I'm responsible for atrocities that horrified the galaxy, you're still sitting across from me, playing chess, treating me as a person rather than a monster. That's compassion. Or stupidity. Perhaps both, but I prefer to think of it as humanity in its form. Leaned forward. Do you know what happened after the Empire fell? How the various species treated former Imperial officials? Shook his head. They executed anyone above the rank of regional administrator. The vegans sent former officials to labor camps where most died within a year. They simply vaporized entire imperial colonies, regardless of whether the inhabitants had supported the regime or been victims of it. And humans. Humans established truth and reconciliation commissions. You sought to understand what had happened, to document the crimes, to provide justice where possible and healing where justice was impossible. Even for your enemies, you tried to find a path toward redemption. Captured's queen with his bishop, a move that seemed to surprise the former emperor. Maybe we're just too naive to know better. Or maybe you understand something about justice that the rest of us have forgotten. Studied the new board position with interest. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about restoration, about finding a way to repair the damage that's been done. Some damage can't be repaired. No, it can't, but that doesn't mean the attempt isn't worthwhile. Made a defensive move with his remaining rook. These conversations with you have taught me more about the true nature of justice than 47 years of wielding absolute power ever did. What do you mean? You see me as I am, a war criminal, a man responsible for unimaginable suffering. But you also see me as a person capable of growth, of understanding, of regret. You've shown me that redemption might be possible even for someone like me. I'm not trying to redeem you, said quickly. I know, that's what makes it meaningful. Moved his king, setting up what recognized as a defensive formation. Redemption isn't something that can be granted by another person. It's something that must be earned through understanding, through genuine remorse, through a commitment to do better. Realized he was close to achieving checkmate. And have you earned it? I don't know, I may never know. But for the first time in my life, I understand what it would mean to try. They finished the game in contemplative silence. When finally achieved checkmate, nodded approvingly. Your best game yet. You're beginning to think like a strategist rather than just a player. As packed up the chess pieces, he found himself struggling with a decision he hadn't anticipated having to make. There's something I need to tell you. Oh, I've been filing reports about our sessions. Standard procedure for the rehabilitation program. but I haven't included any information about your identity or our conversations about your past. Look surprised, why not? Because I don't think it's relevant to your rehabilitation. You're not the same person who ordered the genocide. You've changed, grown, learned to see the horror of what you did. Met the old man's eyes. I think that's worth something. The authorities will discover who I am eventually. Probably, but until then, you deserve the chance to continue this process of understanding yourself and what you've done. Stood to leave. I'll see you tomorrow for our regular session. As the blast door sealed behind him, felt a strange sense of peace. He had made his choice, and it felt right. Not because deserved compassion, but because extending that compassion was fundamentally human. Walking through the detention center corridors, past a group of guards discussing the latest news from the Galactic Council. The War Crimes Tribunal was still searching for former Emperor, still hopping to bring closure to the millions of beings who had suffered under Imperial rule. Said nothing. He had learned something important about humanity over the past few days, something that had helped him understand. The measure of a species wasn't found in their triumphs or their tragedies, but in how they treated those who had wronged them. Humanity's greatest achievement wasn't their military victories or their technological advances. It was their refusal to let hate consume them, their insistence on seeing the potential for redemption even in their worst enemies. The next day, returned to Cell 7 Alpha with his chess set, ready to continue the most important game of his life. Not the game on the board, but the deeper game of understanding what it meant to be human in a universe that often seemed designed to strip away humanity. Was waiting for him, and for the first time since learning the truth, genuinely smiled when he saw the old man. Because that's what humans did. They chose compassion over vengeance, understanding over hatred, redemption over revenge. It was, realized, what made them worthy of their place among the stars.